Living in 2018 is extremely challenging for women, but being a believer and a woman is especially difficult. The Bible is filled with many stories of strong and courageous women, from Deborah, Abigail, Esther, and many more. Today, a vibrant woman joins us. She is the Public Outreach Coordinator for Americans for Limited Government, a contributing editor for the Daily Torch, and one of the most respected young voices of conservative women. Let's welcome Natalia Castro. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly an honor.
So I want to get down to the nitty-gritty. Is it possible for women to stand for women's rights and be conservative?
Well, it's very difficult. Nowadays, the word feminism has been conflated with this very liberal feminist narrative, and it's made it difficult for conservative women to stand up for women's rights. But it's important to remember that every woman and every person can defend women's rights, can support equality of the sexes, and it doesn't necessarily mean submitting to a liberal political agenda. So a lot of what we hear nowadays when we think of feminism is the women at the march and the very pro-choice movement. And I think that as conservative women, we also believe in standing up for ourselves and being independent women, but that doesn't necessarily need to mean what the very political idea of feminism has made it mean. So yes, it's possible, but it could be difficult.
So it seems like the definition of feminism has changed in the past few years. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't even say the definition of feminism has changed. I would more say the connotation of feminism has changed. Rather than looking at feminism for what it is, a fight for equality, we've started looking at it as a very anti-male agenda. It's an agenda that women need to be brought above men. And the way that it kind of creates that narrative is by saying, women have been viewed as less than men for so long, and we need to fight back. But feminism and equality shouldn't be based in anger or fighting. It should be based in a hope and a very positive image of empowering women and lifting them. And I think that because of the change in connotation, it's almost taken on a completely different definition than what it's really meant to be, which is, like I said, something very positive.
So Natalia, where can we vote for you? No, but honestly, we agree with you. The definition of feminism truly hasn't changed, but I agree that women have been so confined for so long that now that, you know, we're able to speak out and do a little bit more, it's almost taken it too far. And it's challenging too, because I believe that the country as a whole is in an identity crisis, so to speak. You know, women are becoming stronger, and not necessarily stronger in a positive way, if you look at the liberal left side view of things, but men are also becoming weaker.
Absolutely. And I think that is a big part of the problem with modern feminism, is that it equates the strength of women with the idea that they can only be strong if they are this very single boxed kind of feminist woman. I think a big problem we see is that liberal feminists don't want to support women like Kellyanne Conway, who was the first woman to lead a successful presidential campaign with President Trump. And that should be a great accomplishment that all women celebrate. But instead, we see liberal women who are saying, oh, because we don't believe Trump is a feminist, we don't believe Kellyanne Conway can be a feminist, and we don't believe that she's a powerful woman. And then rather than just supporting women, we're only supporting certain women. So I think it's really important that when we see a woman rise, when we see people do well, we do support that and we encourage it, and not look at it as an opportunity to take other people down. And I think that's a big part of what you're saying, you know, exactly what you said, this idea that women are getting so powerful that it's almost become a detriment because it's only certain women can be this powerful and they have to adhere to a certain agenda. We can't just all rise and think for ourselves and think however we want to.
So how can we be a woman that stands for women's rights and also a conservative at the same time? Where's that line?
I think it's something that needs to be done more internally. I think what we see with liberal feminists is that in order for them to kind of believe in rising, a lot of these women want to push their own agenda, like I've said. But it needs to be something that comes from the inside. It needs to be something that makes us feel empowered. So whether you are in media, whether you are in politics, whether you're in business, to be an empowered woman, you just need to take that individual step up. You need to fight for what you believe in and maintain your principles and maintain your values. And then it doesn't matter what the other feminists around you are doing or what they're saying, but it's about you and how you advance and push yourself forward. Again, Kellyanne Conway is a great example of that. She kind of stayed true to what she believed in. She led the presidential campaign really based on her gut. She knew we need to help middle America. These are people that I know and I have experience with. And she used that to propel herself forward. And I think that's something that every conservative woman can do. No matter what their industry is or their political affiliation, from the inside, they can fight for what they believe in.
So I'm a career fundraiser. Kellyanne Conway is one of my heroes. I can't believe what she did with the campaign. You know, the president that was practically, voted against from the beginning. People said that he was never going to become president. And here she is running a campaign that's nearly impossible. And she makes it happen. And I think that all women should be proud of that. I agree with you that we shouldn't be pushing each other down, especially when it comes to certain issues. We should be lifting each other up.
Exactly.
Now,
yeah.
What are some political issues that are specific to women in particular that we need to be watchful of today in this day and age?
I think one important one that, especially right now in Congress, there's a lot of talk about is paid leave. Because a lot of women women really do understand that in order to have a child and be able to work, there's going to be some give and take. But a big problem with large federal government paid leave policies is that they try to give women a very defined amount of time that they can take off work. And they mandate companies very specific requirements for how long women and even men can take off work after they've had a child. And that's something that women should be weary of. The federal government doesn't know how long I need to be with my child more than me. And the federal government also doesn't know what the best working situation is for me. So very large federal government policies that mandate paid leave can often do more to hurt women than they do help women. So especially as this issue is kind of becoming in the forefront for Congress right now. I know Senator Rubio just introduced some legislation. It's been a big talking point for Ivanka Trump. We need to be weary of a large federal government policy that might end up hurting us more than it helps us. But on the other side of that, it is important that some form of paid leave does come, some legislation does pass to give women more options. So this is going to be something that we have to watch very closely because, typical with feminism, it can be really strong for women, but if it's too much, it can be to our detriment.
I can't imagine being told that 2 weeks is sufficient, or 3 weeks, or even 3 months. Especially for women that suffer from PTSD from childbirth or have a difficult childbirth themselves or a C-section. Surgery is something very difficult to recover from. But I know people oftentimes take a lot more time from recovering from a surgery than childbirth itself. So I agree. It's definitely something that we need to be watchful of. Is there any other policies that are coming into the mix at this moment that we need to be more careful about or more watchful of?
I think that for women, one thing that we really need to be focusing on that a lot of times isn't really taken as like a woman's issue is what's going on with the tax cuts and jobs. Because there's a lot of worry that if we don't have a Republican majority, a lot of these tax cuts aren't going to be extended. And one thing that the tax cut bill did very effectively is that it encouraged companies to offer things like paid leave. It expanded a lot of the child tax credits, and for families and for working mothers, it provided a lot of additional opportunity. So I think that for women particularly, focusing on the economy, focusing on these issues that aren't even traditionally women's issues is going to be really important, because we want to make sure that the job growth and the opportunities that women are experiencing because of this tax cut are maintained. And that's going to be a really important issue, especially looking at the midterms.
Now, what is your feeling on equal pay, which I know has been very popular as of late? So I want to know your personal perspective on equal pay.
I think one of the most important things to realize is that legislation mandating equal pay has already existed in this country since the 60s. So the federal government has already done its job in saying there should not be discrimination. Now I think we need to change the narrative a little bit, because we do still often hear about the 77 cents to a dollar that women get paid. And what a lot of people don't realize is a big part of the reason for that is because women are often not taught negotiation skills. Mm-hmm. Women often don't go into STEM fields or other high-paying fields. So while it's not women's fault, it is more of a cultural change that needs to happen than a legislative one. So rather than the federal government trying to enact another piece of legislation saying don't discriminate, I think it's something that needs to be changed in how we raise our daughters and how we teach them in school and how we encourage them to enter fields they might not be traditionally comfortable with. And so I think that if we want to achieve the great idea of equal pay, then us as mothers, as sisters, as family members need to help encourage women, have the hard conversations with them, encourage them to talk to their bosses. I'm part of several conservative women's organizations. And one of the most common questions I get asked is from other girls is, how do I ask my boss for a raise? Because I've just never felt like I have the ability to do that. And I think being able to empower women to say, you can ask for what you believe you deserve, then that can go a long way in helping close some of that gap that we see.
I am so excited you're on the program. Honestly, these are issues that I think that we've swept under the rug for too often, especially as Christian women, as believers, especially in church. We're always, not always, and I don't want to play this card by any means, but oftentimes, we hear 1 Timothy quite often that women should be quiet in church. And so I think that empowering women and raising women that are strong and assertive will definitely help not only households and their family life, but also the workplace. We are living in a double income society where most parents have to work each. We don't live in the society where a man can take care of the household and the woman can stay at home as things used to be. And so women are also having to come out of their homes into a new field, into a new environment that they're not familiar with.
Absolutely. Many women come from families where maybe their mother or their grandmother didn't work, or they chose not to work, which is a beautiful and a noble choice. But as more and more women enter the labor force, I think instilling within women the ability to feel empowered and to not rely on that empowerment from the government or from an institution, but it comes from the family, and it comes from us teaching the girls around us, like I said before, that you can ask for what you believe you deserve is going to go a very long way, because it's all about empowering women, and it shouldn't be about tearing men down. It shouldn't be about, debating which women we agree with and don't agree with on every issue. We can have intellectual discussion and still empower each other and raise each other up. And I think that is very important.
So what can we do as women for this political culture? How can we make our voices heard? How can we act and actually participate in something that will make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for future generations?
Well, I think there's a twofold approach here. And I think the first is kind of what I was just talking about for a little bit about, doing it within the family, doing it within your friend group, doing it within the people you interact with every day. I recently read a really interesting article about women in an office who all started banding together to provide each other and some of the lower income women in their office with certain health supplies that women need and don't normally have access to, like the tampons and stuff like that. And they started working together to make that possible for each other. And so I think in our social environment, trying to just empower and lift up other women is really important. But the other side of that, something that has been really awesome in the conservative movement lately, is a lot of conservative women's groups have started rising up. So like the Network of Enlightened Women is a conservative women's book club that these women meet weekly usually and read different books together and kind of talk about conservative issues. The Independent Women's Forum is another great group. Future Female Leaders does a lot of work in inspiring and uplifting conservative women. And there are a lot of organizations like that as conservative women, we can become part of to make our voices heard. And they're not all political policy. A lot of it is just social groups and kind of making that cultural change happen that helps to uplift and empower women.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, but I think that this is an important question. Half of our viewership is men, and then the other half are women. So my question is, why does it matter what a woman does, or socially or politically, to a man? And why does it matter to society as a whole, essentially?
When we only have half of a perspective, then we're never going to grow. Let's be honest, men have led most of the history in this country, but there have always been strong women behind them, helping that, facilitating it, and growing these ideas. And I think men need to realize, and it's a huge problem that has come with the modern feminist movement, women don't want to take over the world. We just want to have equal footing in our future and be able to, when we have the strong idea, bring it forward. And we can all grow from more diverse viewpoints, more diverse thoughts, and it can only help the country. There is no harm to being able to hear a more diverse viewpoint. And I think that what we will realize is when we have more women feeling like they can speak up, that we're only going to see more success across the board for everyone. And we're only going to raise stronger children and have stronger families.
Welcome back to Shabbat Night Live, and we just want to say a special thank you to those that stood with us, that stand with us on a daily basis, stand for the truth with this ministry for as long as we can. As Michael would say, we're going to continue delivering the message of Yeshua throughout the entire world for as long as we can, until they literally shut us down. And according to news lines, it seems like it's going to happen a lot sooner than we anticipated. So hopefully we have a few good years with you to go. But we were discussing women's issues with Natalia Castro, an incredible woman that is living in Washington, D.C., belongs to the Americans for Limited Government, an incredible journalist. And we're excited to have you back to discuss a topic that many Americans don't pay any attention to, which is the EPA.
Yes, and the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yes, what we were discussing off the air just briefly. We've encountered, we meaning my husband and I, have encountered the EPA more than once on a regular basis because of the business that we have. We own an off-road side-by-side business. We build aftermarket parts for these vehicles, and so they're off-road vehicles. So we often have to go off-road into a lot of government-mandated land. And so we run into a lot of issues where a lot of parks and even whether private or public get shut down because of EPA regulations. So for the average American, you said it was what does the EPA stand for?
Environmental Protection Agency.
Perfect. And what does that matter to us as Americans?
So the EPA had this very basic original goal of protecting the environment across the country. And through most of the administrations that the EPA existed under, it did a great job of kind of just working with the Department of Interior to, like you said, make sure our parks were upheld, that kind of stuff. But under President Obama, the agenda changed a little bit because Obama took on a really strong climate change agenda. And what the EPA started doing was using litigation. So basically, an environmentalist group in, let's say, Nebraska would sue the federal government saying, we don't think you're doing enough to protect this river. And then the EPA would settle the lawsuit, and which is called sue and settle, and expand its power to then protect said river. And that might not seem like it's too big of a deal to the average person, but under the Obama administration, this actually happened hundreds of times. There were hundreds of these cases. And what it allowed the EPA to do is basically take control over waterways across the country, parks across the country, and it invaded a lot of local jurisdictions, all in the name of protecting the environment. And that took a really big hit on local economies because businesses that can normally thrive without any federal government intervention were suddenly being told, no, you need to do these three things in order to be able to even exist on this land. And it was a really big financial detriment that existed under the Obama administration.
I can't imagine owning, which has happened, and we've read through the news over the past few years, owning private land that your family has lived on for hundreds of years, and then being told that that land no longer belongs to you, and we're allowed this portion of the land to survive under your name, but you have to follow these regulations and rules.
Exactly. And that's a lot of what happened under the Obama administration. And like I said, that really hurt local economies. But even more, that wasn't the original purpose for the EPA. Mm-hmm. The EPA wasn't supposed to be involved in all these local jurisdictions. So what started happening is what used to take 2 weeks for a person to get a permit to use a certain piece of land started taking months on end. In fact, when the Trump administration took over the EPA, they found that projects were months behind. Permits were months behind. There was no accountability in regional offices that the EPA monitored. And there was abuse across the entire system. So what we saw was that by taking on so much responsibility that the EPA was not in their original authority, not only did it hurt these local communities, but the EPA was no longer effectively able to do their job. So they weren't even able to help the environment like they were supposed to be.
Well, that sounds like a lot of portions of our government offices today. But how do these regulations affect average Joe that works in the mill 9 to 5, and then goes home to his family every single day, aside from the economic differences within his town or his state? How would it affect him long term? I really just want to put it into the perspective of our average viewer, why this is something that they need to consider being more thoughtful about.
So I think there's two major ways. The first is in wage stagnation. So someone who has normally seen maybe raises every year under the Trump administration, especially like your mill workers, people who work in grocery stores, a lot of the middle to low income Americans who are just trying to live and support their family saw wage stagnation completely because of this overregulation. So a lot of Americans, without even realizing it, took a direct hit to their paychecks. And that's not even like the local economy. That's just them particularly. But the second way is the EPA actually just released a report talking about how one of the standards that they put in place in the last few years has actually been hurting the environment. and that they thought would help the environment has actually been hurting the environment. And it deals a lot with ethanol and the gas that we put in our cars. So the gas that we've been putting in our cars, because of EPA standards, has been less clean for the environment and less efficient. So for every American that goes to the gas pump, just tries to fill up their cars and keep going, we've seen a spike in gas prices and less fuel efficiency because of these EPA regulations. So those are just two ways that it really directly hurts the people at home, both when they get their paychecks at the end of the month and when they go to fill up their car every couple weeks.
Well, this brings up a good question, fracking. Is it really as bad as the news tells us it is? Does it really affect our environment that much?
It doesn't. And in short, it doesn't. But it's also important to realize that a lot of the better options that the media and the left comes up with are also not as effective for our environment. Like I said, that ethanol mandate. So that was supposed to be a replacement for fracking, but it ends up hurting the environment just as much and lowering our fuel economy. So a lot of these alternatives that we try to think of are just as bad or worse. So the impact of fracking is then much lower when you're comparing it to other clean energy options. So, you gotta take what you hear in the media with a grain of salt a lot of the times, because there's a huge industry that's against fracking on the left, and they're pushing this very false narrative of ideas that only hurt the environment more. So it's definitely a controversial issue, but it should not be as bad as it is.
Well, and it also brings us to the point that we're so dependent on other nations for our oil. And that's what usually causes us to have so many difficulties. A lot of our wars have been started over oil itself because we're dependent on them. And if we were independent, it would make it a little bit easier for us to be self-sufficient, but also for us to regulate the oil production, and not to mention just the impact that it would create on our economy itself.
Of course. And, the United States has for a long time been viewed not just as a global authority, but also very much as a moral authority. And as a Hispanic woman, I've always taken issue with the fact that the United States, we talk a lot about Venezuela and how horrible our relationship with Venezuela is and how much they dislike the United States, but we still get oil from them. And a lot of the world does. And that is the reason that the dictator in Venezuela is able to hurt his own people. Mm-hmm. And fuel independence in the United States, energy independence, isn't just about helping our economy, but it's also about lessening our dependence on these volatile countries that often do not respect the rights of their people, do not respect the rights of women, or lead essentially in religious law. Like there's across the Middle East and even in South America. And a big part of our energy independence is separating ourselves from those countries so that we aren't, by mistake, fueling a horrible regime.
So has nuclear power production been really that much safer over the past 40 years? Or how much focus has been put on nuclear power production? Because I know for a fact that they're constantly growing and they're constantly hiring. Every nuclear plant that we've ever seen, my husband and I, again, because of his line of work, we get to interact with a lot of people that work there. So there's been a continuous growth. Is it not true?
No, the growth within the nuclear energy industry is incredible, but it has been stifled because a few different pieces of legislation that have kind of come into place over the last 30 to 40 years. One important issue has been nuclear waste. And a big reason why nuclear energy hasn't been able to move into the forefront within the United States is because in an effort to protect the environment, President Obama canceled the plans for Yucca Mountain, which is a mountain in Nevada that was deemed by environmentalist economists, groups across the country. This mountain was deemed as the most safe place to place nuclear waste. But some Nevada Democratic representatives talked to President Obama and basically said, we don't want that in our backyard. And so President Obama canceled all of those plans. So now there's no safe place to put nuclear waste. In fact, a study came out, I believe last year, that was very interesting and highlighted that because there is no single place to put nuclear waste, it is dispersed across the country, and over 80 to 90% of our nuclear waste is within 60 miles of a major city. So it's actually in more dangerous places now because we don't have a single safe location. And that has really stifled the advancement of nuclear energy because there's a huge liability there. But if we are able to, and it's been a big push within Trump's EPA to reopen Yucca Mountain as a place for nuclear waste to be held, and to change some other of the laws regulating nuclear waste and nuclear energy so that that can be a thriving industry within the United States.
So the perception of the risk of nuclear power and the actual risks are very different. Again, you're saying take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at countries like France, who normally I wouldn't agree with most stuff that's done in France. They have really taken over nuclear energy and made it efficient and effective and safe. And that can be done in the United States too, but it's government regulations that came from this very noble goal of, we want it to be clean, we want to make sure it's the most safe it can be, but as very often happens when you have government regulation in the free market, it's only stifled that advancement for what could be a very safe and available energy source.
Do you mind explaining to us here in America how France takes care of their nuclear power plants so that we can use it as a comparison, but most of us don't know?
Of course. So one thing France has become very good at doing is called nuclear reprocessing. And what that basically means is after they have created, let's say, one stable amount of nuclear energy, they've actually learned how to recycle it and separate the dangerous chemicals from the usable energy chemicals and reuse that usable energy to make it a more long-lasting energy source. And what that also does is it eliminates about half of the waste that we would normally see if we were working with nuclear energy, say 50 years ago. So because they've been able to do that, they've made it a much safer and more stable process. And nuclear reprocessing was actually banned in the United States about 30 years ago because there was a fear that if people knew how to reprocess and recycle nuclear energy, they might use it to create weapons. But as France has shown, when it's done responsibly, there's no real risk of accidentally creating a nuclear weapon or accidentally leaking nuclear energy because it's a proven process that works. And so a lot of these archaic laws that were put in place when we didn't know about nuclear energy should now be changed with the new knowledge that we have.
And those laws, you call them archaic. When were they put in place? Just to give us a reference.
Most of these laws were put in place between the 60s and the 80s. So not too archaic, but in terms of energy development, like I said, they were put in place with the goal of, a very Cold War mentality of, this could be a risk, so we need to contain it. But now that energy has advanced, we see that what we once thought was a risk is now much safer and much more secure than we thought it once was.
So what created the fear in nuclear weapons? Do you have an idea of what initiated that fear, aside from what possibly could be in these original laws? What has really created the view worldwide that nuclear weapons are something that we should be fearful of, and something that everyone can create in their backyard, essentially?
I think a lot of people, especially so nuclear weapons came before nuclear energy did. And because of that, a lot of people only looked at this as for weaponry, as militarized, rather than looking at it as a stable energy source. And it wasn't until people really learned about how to process and reprocess energy that they realized, wait a second, if we're not enriching this with uranium, then it's not dangerous, or at least it's not, like going to turn weaponized, it can actually be an energy source. So I think a big problem is just the order of events. And like I said, it was a very much a Cold War mentality that we were so focused on militarizing and weaponry that we let the idea of a stable energy source kind of fall to the wayside. And I think that was a really big problem.
So I want to ask this question, because I'm sure our viewers at this point have had this on their mind. What does this matter to us as believers, truly? What does it matter that we're discussing EPA and nuclear weapons? As a Christian, what would you say?
I would say that one of the kind of, at least to me, a very central part of Christianity is this idea that we have all been placed on this planet with very specific purposes, with ways to advance, with ways to kind of use the resources around us. And as believers, we believe that whenever there is an opportunity, we should be able to pursue it. And it's by God's blessing that these things have been put into our lives. And I think what has happened is our government has tried to regulate our environment and has tried to overregulate the world around us. And as believers, we should stand up and say, no, the United States is blessed with resources. We have been truly blessed with this beautiful land and this beautiful environment, and we should be able to use it, and we should be able to use it to advance and to spread our values. And I think a big part of it is a little bit of what I talked about earlier. We see countries like Venezuela, where their dictatorship is so absent of God's way. And as a moral authority in the United States, being able to be energy independent and not fund that regime is truly, that is how we act as a beacon for the world, by saying we are blessed with these resources and we will give them to other countries so that other countries don't have to fund Venezuela and fund Iran and fund Iraq, and countries that like I said, are in a lot of way are unfortunately absent of God's way in their leadership. And so I think that by taking in our resources and using them to better the world, that is truly in God's plan for this country.
Amen. Natalia, it's been such an honor having you here on this program. We look forward to having you in the future as well.
Absolutely. I'm very happy I could come.
Thank you for spending Shabbat Night Live with us. We hope this series with Natalia Castro has inspired you to make a change, whether here in America or in your home country. After all, this is our future. We have the ability to shape how it will look and what our future will face. Matthew 5:13 says that we are the salt of the earth and we are the light. May our light shine brighter than ever this Shabbat. We'll see you next Shabbat Night Live. Have a good night.